Richard Okoro was the kind of man who seemed untouchable. From the dusty lanes of a forgotten village, he had risen to become a billionaire whose name alone could open doors and close deals. His life was a portrait of triumph. Gleaming skyscrapers bore his company's logo, his speeches drew applause from global conferences, and his wealth funded schools and hospitals across the nation. To the outside world, Richard was not just a man, he was an institution. But behind the walls of his lavish mansion, in the silent hours of the night, Richard felt a gnawing emptiness he could not ignore. For months, a shadow had crept over his marriage, one that even his billions could not chase away. His wife, Angela, had once been his anchor, gentle, supportive, radiant with a love that had fueled him during his toughest days. Yet lately her affection had grown distant, her laughter rehearsed, her gaze often drifting elsewhere. It began with small things. A phone vibrating under the pillow at midnight answered in whispers. Weekend, family visits that never matched the cousin's stories. Jewelry receipts for items Richard never saw her wear. He tried to dismiss them at first. After all, suspicion was a poison and paranoia had ruined stronger men than him. But then came Daniel. Daniel was Richard's younger brother, charming and ambitious, though always a step behind Richard's brilliance. He had been welcomed into the mansion as family, but lately Richard had noticed the softness in Angela's eyes when Daniel spoke, a softness that had vanished whenever she looked at her own husband. That glance, fleeting as it was, burned itself into Richard's memory. He wrestled with his thoughts alone. Was he imagining things? Was the weight of power making him distrustful of those closest to him? Or was there, beneath Angela's flawless smiles and Daniel's respectful gestures, a betrayal festering in silence? Richard had built his empire on facts, strategy, and foresight, but in his heart he had only doubt. One restless night, as he sat alone in his study, staring at the city skyline glittering like a sea of jewels, a decision crystallized in his mind. If Angela still loved him, grief would expose it. If she no longer did, then his death, whether real or staged, would unmask her true heart. It was a dangerous thought, outrageous even, but Richard had not built his fortune by fearing bold ideas. He would die, at least in the eyes of the world. He would vanish, watching from the shadows as the woman he loved either mourned sincerely or revealed herself as something far darker. For the first time in years, Richard smiled, not with joy but with grim resolve. His wealth had won him many battles, but this, the battle for truth, would require the greatest gamble of his life. And so, the billionaire began to plan his own death. The decision once made, Richard Okoro wasted no time. A man of his stature did not survive the ruthless business world by hesitation. Still, the plan he was about to set in motion demanded absolute secrecy. He chose only 3 people he trusted without question: his lawyer, Emmanuel Ademi, his personal physician, Dr. Chaik Obi, and his bodyguard of 15 years, a quiet giant named Musa. One late evening, the 4 of them sat in Richard's study, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books and oil paintings of his ancestors. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled before him, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his scheme. "I need to disappear," he said simply. "For a week, maybe 2. To the world I must be dead. Only you 3 will know the truth." Emmanuel, the lawyer, blinked in shock. "Sir, do you understand what you're saying? A man of your influence, if word spreads that you've died, entire markets will shake." "That is precisely the point," Richard replied. "I want to see what collapses and, more importantly, what survives." His eyes flicked toward the window, as though Angela's shadow lingered somewhere beyond the glass. Dr. Chaik adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowed. "A staged death. We'd have to falsify medical reports. The hospital board." "You will handle the paperwork," Richard cut in, his tone sharp but not unkind. "A sudden cardiac arrest, quick, unexpected, tragic, people will accept it. Emmanuel will deal with the legal ripples. And Musa," he turned to the bodyguard who had been silent as a stone, "you will get me out and keep me hidden until the time comes." Musa's deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "If this is what you want, sir, I will see it done." The room fell into silence. Richard's gaze moved from one man to the other. They understood the gravity of what he was asking. It wasn't only deception, it was a test of loyalty, and they passed. 3 days later, the nation woke to the shocking news. Billionaire industrialist Richard Okoro, dead at 52. The headlines screamed across newspapers, television, and social media. Cameras swarmed the hospital where he had supposedly breathed his last breath. The official statement, signed by Dr. Chaik himself, confirmed a massive heart attack. The world reacted with disbelief. Stock prices of his companies plummeted overnight, wiping millions from the market. Shareholders scrambled, political leaders issued statements of condolence, and television stations ran hour-long specials celebrating his rags-to-riches journey. His portrait, proud and solemn, filled every screen. In the streets, ordinary citizens mourned him. Some lit candles outside his corporate headquarters, while others cried openly, remembering the scholarships his foundation had provided. A nation grieved as though it had lost a king. But the king was alive. Far from the city's chaos, Richard sat in a secluded villa tucked away in the countryside, dressed in a simple robe, stripped of the aura of wealth that usually surrounded him. Before him, a large television flickered, showing footage of Angela arriving at the hospital in a black veil, tears streaming down her cheeks as she collapsed into Daniel's arms. Richard leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Was that grief or relief? He replayed the clip again and again, searching for an answer. Her sobs looked real enough, her body shook with convincing sorrow. And yet he knew Angela well. She had been an actress in her youth before she became his wife. Performance came easily to her. The camera cut to Daniel, standing tall beside her, his hand resting a little too comfortably on her shoulder. Richard's chest tightened. "Patience," he whispered to himself. "The truth will come." Hours turned into days. Coverage of his death filled every channel. Business rivals speculated about who would inherit his empire. Friends called Angela a pillar of strength. Even his estranged cousins began appearing on talk shows, suddenly eager to speak of their close bond with the late billionaire. Richard watched it all with a storm of emotions swirling inside him. There was bitterness, seeing people he had lifted from nothing now clamor to profit from his supposed absence. There was fear. What if Angela and Daniel were innocent and he was about to destroy everything with baseless suspicion? There was excitement, the thrill of the test he had set into motion. And buried beneath it all, a fragile sliver of hope, that perhaps when the funeral came, his wife's grief would prove her loyalty beyond doubt. At night, as the countryside winds rattled the windows of the villa, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He was a man declared dead, watching his life unravel from the shadows. It was both liberating and terrifying. 1 week remained until the funeral. That would be the stage, the final act of his deception. And in that moment of mourning, when masks tend to fall, he would finally discover the truth. The news of Richard Okoro's death sent ripples not just through the nation, but across the globe. Within hours of the official announcement, Angela Okoro, his widow, was thrust into the spotlight. Newspapers described her as the grieving pillar of strength, a woman shattered by loss yet dignified enough to stand tall for the sake of her late husband's legacy. Angela played her role perfectly. Cameras caught her stepping out of the hospital in a flowing black gown, a delicate lace veil covering her face. Her sobs were muffled, her voice cracked as she thanked well-wishers for their prayers. Hands trembled as she clutched Daniel's arm for support. To the public, she was a portrait of sorrow. But behind closed doors, Angela was a different woman. Within the Okoro mansion, away from journalists and mourners, her grief melted into something sharper, something colder. When the servants bowed and whispered condolences, she accepted them with a graceful nod, but her eyes betrayed no tears. She moved through the house briskly, issuing orders for the upcoming funeral like a general preparing for war. "The flowers must be imported lilies," she told the event planner in a clipped tone. "No cheap substitutes, and make sure the coffin is mahogany with gold trimming, nothing less. This is Richard Okoro we are burying after all." The planner, visibly nervous, scribbled notes furiously. "And the guest list?" Angela pressed. Every politician, every shareholder, every business rival, I want the hall full. Let the world know how much my husband meant to them. Richard, watching all this from the hidden villa through the live feed of his mansion's security cameras, narrowed his eyes. He saw no trace of brokenness in her expression, only control and precision. She wasn't mourning, she was managing. Daniel's presence only deepened his unease. Richard's younger brother had always been around, but now he lingered far too close. He shadowed Angela like a protector, his hand always ready to steady her elbow, his gaze lingering longer than propriety allowed. Once, through the hidden camera in Richard's study, he caught Angela and Daniel speaking in low tones. "Everything is happening so fast," Angela whispered, her fingers nervously twisting her veil. Daniel placed a hand over hers. "That's the way it must be. Stay calm. Soon all of this will belong to you and to us." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, to us." Richard's stomach turned. The words echoed in his head like a curse. "To us." The mansion itself became a theater of whispers. Wealthy cousins who hadn't visited in years appeared suddenly, dressed in black silk and crocodile tears, murmuring about their closeness to the late billionaire. Business partners circled like vultures, speculating about the will. Would Angela inherit everything? Would Daniel play a role in the empire's future? Some muttered that Richard's children from his first marriage might challenge the will. Every corner of the house buzzed with gossip, greed, and anticipation. Richard had expected grief to expose love, but instead, it seemed to have uncovered a hunger for his fortune. Yet still he watched, patient, calculating, silent. He knew people could wear masks in public, but funerals had a way of ripping masks away. That would be the true test. Angela, meanwhile, perfected the details. She hired the most renowned choir to sing hymns. She ordered the hall draped in black and gold, a fitting tribute to the empire Richard had built. She rehearsed her role as the heartbroken widow, ensuring every gesture of despair was flawless. On the eve of the funeral, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting her veil. For a fleeting second, her face hardened, the mask slipping to reveal steel beneath the lace. "To us," she murmured again, her lips curling into a whisper meant for no one. And in his hidden villa, Richard Arcoro clenched his fists. The stage was set. The funeral would be his final test, and perhaps his most dangerous gamble yet. The morning of the funeral dawned heavy with mist. The Arcoro mansion, usually a place of grandeur and power, had been transformed into a palace of mourning. Black drapes covered the golden gates, tall candelabras lined the driveway, and the air smelled of lilies and incense. A steady stream of limousines and luxury cars pulled up, carrying dignitaries, politicians, celebrities, and business rivals who had all come to pay their respects. Inside the great hall, the coffin stood at the center like a monument. Crafted from polished mahogany with golden trimmings, it gleamed beneath the crystal chandelier. Wreaths of roses surrounded it, and a choir sang hymns that echoed through the cavernous space, their voices both angelic and haunting. Angela stood by the coffin, veiled in black lace, her hands trembling as she greeted each mourner. She looked every bit the broken widow, her shoulders hunched, her eyes red, her voice hoarse with grief. Women hugged her, men shook their heads solemnly, whispering, "She is so strong, so brave." Yet for Richard, watching everything from a hidden chamber upstairs through the secret camera feed, the performance felt too perfect. His eyes followed her every movement, the delicate dab of a handkerchief at her eyes, the faint quiver in her lips, the dramatic pauses in her speech. Angela was grieving for the world to see, but was it real? Or was she merely acting for her audience? From his vantage point, Richard could also see Daniel. His younger brother lingered nearby, never straying far from Angela's side. Whenever she swayed as though overcome with sorrow, his hand was instantly there, steadying her arm. Guests admired his devotion, whispering, "Such a supportive brother-in-law." But Richard knew better. The tenderness in Daniel's touch, the way his gaze lingered on Angela through her veil, betrayed a different story altogether. The hall buzzed with speculation. Some guests whispered about the billionaire's empire. Who would control it now? Others wondered about the will. Would Angela inherit everything, or would Richard's estranged children from his first marriage contest it? Still others smirked quietly, rivals already plotting how to seize fragments of his crumbling empire. But the loudest voice in the room was not spoken. It was the silence of suspicion beating in Richard's chest. The choir's hymn faded, replaced by the solemn words of the officiating pastor. He spoke of Richard's legacy, his generosity, his brilliance. The crowd bowed their heads in respect. Angela clutched a tissue and sobbed softly, her body trembling at the exact moments the pastor's words grew emotional. The cameras captured it all, and Richard knew the footage would soon be broadcast to the nation. For a moment, Richard's resolve wavered. What if he was wrong? What if Angela's grief was real? What if his mistrust had led him to orchestrate this cruel deception, only to wound the one woman who had truly loved him? But then, just as quickly, the memory of her whispered words to Daniel, "To us," returned like a knife twisting in his chest. As the service ended, guests lined up to lay flowers atop the coffin. The rustle of fabric, the murmurs of prayers, the flickering candlelight, all painted the scene of a perfect farewell. Angela stood tall, her figure framed by the coffin behind her, like a queen bidding goodbye to her fallen king. Richard's hands tightened into fists as he watched from above. The tension inside him grew unbearable. Was she weeping for her husband, or celebrating the freedom his death had given her? The ceremony concluded with one final hymn. Guests began to file out, their voices hushed with reverence. But Richard did not move from his hidden seat, nor did Angela retreat to her chambers immediately. He knew the funeral was not over, not truly. Because funerals reveal truths not in public tears, but in private whispers. And the moment the hall emptied, Angela's mask would finally slip. When the last echoes of the choir faded and the great hall grew silent, the mansion seemed to exhale. The crowd of mourners, once buzzing like bees, drifted away into the misty evening, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the faint smoke of extinguished candles. The coffin remained in the center of the hall, a monument to a man the world believed dead. Angela excused herself from the remaining guests with a trembling smile, murmuring that she needed a moment alone. Her veil brushed her cheeks as she glided down the corridor, her footsteps soft but hurried. The hallways of the Acoro estate were dim now, lit only by sconces along the walls. Yet Angela moved with familiarity, weaving through the mansion until she reached Richard's private study. The heavy oak doors creaked open and she slipped inside. The room smelled faintly of leather and cigars, filled with the relics of Richard's life, family portraits, bookshelves lined with law and finance, awards gleaming beneath the low lamplight. Angela paused for a moment, staring at a portrait of Richard in his prime. His confident gaze, his hand resting on a globe, seemed to mock her. She exhaled sharply, pulling down the veil as though shedding the final weight of pretense. "You're late," came a voice from the corner. Daniel stepped out of the shadows, his tie loosened, his eyes hungry with anticipation. He closed the door behind her, sealing them both into the private sanctuary. Angela's lips curved into a bitter smile. "I had to play the grieving widow, didn't I? Every eye in that hall was on me." She laughed softly, the sound hollow. "But it's over now. Finally, it's over." Daniel moved closer, his hand brushing her arm with a familiarity that no brother-in-law should dare. "You were flawless. No one suspects a thing. They think you're broken, devastated, when really you're free." Angela leaned against the desk, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. "Free," she repeated, almost tasting the word. "Do you know how long I've waited for this moment, Daniel? Years of silence, years of pretending. Richard's shadow was suffocating me. But now," she gestured to the shelves, the trophies, the empire that Richard had built. "Now all of this will be mine." "Ours," Daniel corrected, his voice low and firm. He cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. "Don't forget what we planned. Everything he owned, everything he controlled, it will be in your name, and I'll be right beside you." She smiled again, this time warmer, touched with desire. "Yes, ours, and to think the great Richard Acoro never saw it coming. He trusted me, he trusted you. He thought his empire would live on through loyalty and family." Her eyes gleamed. "How blind he was." Above them in the secret chamber hidden behind the study walls, Richard listened. His body shook as though every word were a dagger piercing his chest. The monitors displayed every angle of the room, catching every glance, every touch. His wife's voice, once his solace, now shredded his soul. He wanted to scream, to burst through the door and drag them both into the open, but rage rooted him in silence. His fists clenched until his knuckles turned white, tears threatening but refusing to fall. For years he had built his empire with sweat and sacrifice, and for years he had loved Angela with unshakable devotion. To see it all twisted into betrayal, it was a pain no grave could hold. Down below, Angela ran her hand along Richard's desk, tracing the edges with almost mocking tenderness. He thought he was untouchable, but death has a way of humbling kings. Tomorrow, the lawyers will read the will, and when they do, the world will know that everything passes to me. Daniel chuckled, slipping an arm around her waist. And after that, we disappear for a while. Let the world mourn him while we celebrate our victory. Imagine it, Angela. No more secrets, no more stolen moments. Just us living the life he never wanted you to have. Her eyes softened as she leaned into him. Just us. Richard pressed a hand against the cold wall, his breath ragged. Every word confirmed what his heart had feared. His wife, his brother, his legacy, everything had been poisoned by betrayal. Yet within the agony, a seed of steel began to grow. They thought he was gone, buried in memory and song. But Richard Okoro was very much alive, and if betrayal had brought him to this edge, then vengeance would bring him back. In the quiet of his hidden chamber, he whispered to himself, "You'll regret this, Angela. Both of you will." And in that moment, the funeral was no longer the end. It was only the beginning. The study was cloaked in shadows, its silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. Angela poured amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses, her movements elegant, precise, as though the act itself was a ritual. Daniel leaned back in Richard's leather chair, spinning it slightly, savoring the sense of power that had always been denied him. "To Richard," Angela said bitterly, raising her glass, "may his empire rest in peace." Daniel smirked and clinked his glass against hers. "No, Angela, not in peace, in our hands." They both drank deeply, the fire of the liquor burning their throats, fueling their excitement. Angela placed her glass down and leaned against the desk, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "We'll have to move quickly. Once the will is read tomorrow, I'll inherit the lion's share. But before the vultures circle, we should liquidate a portion of the assets, stocks, overseas accounts, properties abroad. If anyone suspects, well, it'll be too late." Daniel nodded, his expression sharp. "We can arrange for the funds to be moved offshore, Switzerland maybe, and once the dust settles we disappear, a quiet villa in Spain, perhaps, or Dubai, somewhere Richard's ghost can't follow us." Angela let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it, only triumph. "Can you imagine it, Daniel? All those years of living under his rules, pretending, hiding what we felt. Now we'll live openly, richer than ever, untouchable." Their glasses clinked again, sealing the unholy toast. But neither of them noticed the faint creak of the door left slightly ajar, nor the figure who lingered just outside. Mr. Adwale, Richard's longtime lawyer and confidant, had returned to the study to retrieve a file Richard had once requested. He paused, hearing voices, and froze when Angela's laugh cut through the silence. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned closer. The words he overheard chilled him to the bone. "Richard was a fool," Daniel said. "He thought his love made him safe, but it only blinded him." Angela smiled, swirling the last drops of whiskey in her glass. "And tomorrow, the world will weep for him while we celebrate our freedom." The lawyer's grip on the doorknob tightened. His mind raced. Should he confront them now? No, too dangerous. But if Richard had truly been betrayed, if his widow and brother were conspiring against him, then Adwale owed it to his friend to act. Yet doubt gnawed at him. Could grief have driven Angela into desperation? Could Daniel be twisting her words? Or was this truly the face of betrayal Richard had always feared? Inside the hidden chamber, Richard himself was unraveling. His body trembled as he watched them through the monitors, their laughter and toasts tearing into his heart like glass shards. He pressed a hand against his chest, his breath ragged. Rage surged, demanding release. He wanted to storm into the room, drag them both out into the open, expose their treachery before the world. But grief drowned his fury just as quickly. The woman he had loved, the brother he had trusted, both standing over the ashes of his life, rejoicing. He closed his eyes, remembering Angela's laughter when they first met, Daniel's loyalty during his rise. Were those memories lies too? The despair was suffocating, yet beneath it all, something stronger began to rise. A steel resolve forged from the very fire of his humiliation. He had faked his death to test Angela's loyalty. Instead, he had uncovered the full depth of her betrayal. And now, vengeance would be his answer. He whispered into the silence of the chamber, his voice hoarse but steady. "Enjoy this night, Angela. Celebrate Daniel. Tomorrow the will is read. And tomorrow you'll learn that Richard Okoro is not so easily buried." The following morning, the Okoro mansion brimmed with tension. The hall, draped in somber colors from the funeral, now hosted a different kind of gathering. Long tables gleamed with polished wood, chairs arranged neatly for family, advisors, and a select few business associates. The air was thick with whispers, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the unease that comes when wealth hangs in the balance. At the head of the room sat Mr. Adwale, Richard's longtime lawyer. His briefcase rested by his feet, the weight of its contents heavier than gold. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the room, his expression unreadable. Around him, the heirs of Richard Okoro's empire fidgeted, eyes darting nervously. Angela swept in like a queen arriving at her coronation. Draped in black silk, her veil lifted this time, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her lips, painted a subdued shade of red, curled into the faintest smile. She took her place at the front, directly across from Adwale, and folded her hands gracefully in her lap. Daniel slipped in a moment later, choosing a seat near her. His presence was subtle but telling, an anchor at her side. The others noticed, and whispers began to ripple through the hall. "Why is he sitting so close?" one relative murmured. "Strange," another whispered, "almost protective." Angela ignored them all. Her thoughts were elsewhere on the fortune about to be placed in her hands. In her mind, the ceremony was merely a formality. Richard's empire, his companies, his properties, his accounts, all of it would soon be hers to command. The world believed her a grieving widow, and today that mask would grant her everything she desired. Adwale cleared his throat. "We are gathered here for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Okoro," he began solemnly. "Before I proceed, let me remind you all that this document was sealed in accordance with his personal request. None but myself have seen its contents." Angela leaned back in her chair, her smile widening ever so slightly. The lawyer began to read, his voice steady. "I, Richard Okoro, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament." The room grew silent. Every syllable seemed to echo, every pause waited with anticipation. But before Adwale could continue, the heavy doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A gust of wind swept through, rattling the candles. Heads turned, murmurs spread like wildfire. And then he appeared. Richard Okoro stepped into the room, alive. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Several chairs scraped against the floor as people rose to their feet, eyes wide with disbelief. The man they had buried, the man they had mourned, now stood tall in a dark tailored suit, his expression carved from stone. Angela's face drained of color. For a heartbeat, she sat frozen, her lips parted but no sound escaping. Her eyes locked on him, wild with shock. Then her body swayed as if the ground itself had shifted, and she collapsed against her chair with a strangled gasp. "Impossible," Daniel whispered, his face paling. Richard's gaze swept the room, lingering on each stunned face before settling on Angela and her lover brother-in-law. He stepped forward with deliberate calm, his shoes striking the marble floor like thunderclaps. "Did you miss me?" His voice was deep, steady, and filled with a quiet fury that silenced the room. No one dared speak. Angela clutched the edge of the table, struggling to compose herself. "Ah, Richard, but you're dead," he finished coldly, his eyes pierced through her. "No, Angela, not dead, very much alive, and thanks to your performance these past days, I know the truth." Chaos erupted in whispers, gasps, and hurried glances. The hall that had once mourned now trembled with scandal. Angela's mask had shattered, Daniel's confidence had withered, and Richard, returned from the grave, stood ready to reclaim everything that was his. The will was no longer the question. The reckoning had begun. The hall had fallen into stunned silence. Richard's very presence was a thunderclap that shattered the illusion of mourning. Eyes darted between him, Angela, and Daniel, disbelief painted across every face. Richard moved to the center of the room, his back straight, his eyes sharp. He raised a hand, and the murmurs died instantly. "You all came here today to witness the reading of my will," he began, his voice steady, resonant. "But instead, you will witness the truth." With a nod, he signaled to a servant by the door. Hidden projectors whirred to life, and suddenly the wall behind him lit up with flickering images. Gasps erupted as the footage played, grainy but clear. Angela in his study, her veil cast aside. Daniel leaning close, his hand upon her arm, their voices low but unmistakable. "Richard was a fool," Daniel's voice echoed through the hall. Angela's laugh followed. "Tomorrow, the world will mourn while we celebrate our freedom." A collective gasp swept through the room. Relatives clutched at their pearls, business partners shook their heads, and whispers of betrayal rippled like fire. Angela leapt to her feet, her face pale as ashes. "No, it's not what it looks like. I was grieving, I was." "Enough," Richard cut her off, his words sharp as a blade. His gaze was cold, unyielding. "You grieved well, Angela, too well. The world believed your tears. I almost believed them too, until I heard what you truly whispered in the dark." Daniel rose, fists clenched. "This is madness. You faked your death to trap us, to humiliate us." "To reveal you," Richard corrected, stepping closer. His towering presence made Daniel falter. "I gave you both love, I gave you trust, and in return you gave me betrayal." Angela fell to her knees, her sobs breaking through the room's tension. "Richard, please, I made a mistake. I was weak. I was lonely without you. Forgive me, I beg you." But Richard's eyes did not soften. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of final judgment. "I died in your heart long before I faked my death. What I buried was not my body, but the illusion that you ever loved me." The words struck harder than any blow. Angela covered her face, her cries muffled. Daniel, trembling, searched for words but found none. Around them, the guests' faces were etched with disgust, pity, or cold silence. Richard turned away, his resolve like iron. "The will is unchanged. My fortune will not pass to traitors. Today, the empire I built will be protected from those who wish to destroy it." And with that, he left them. Angela collapsed, Daniel broken, and the hall whispering of a betrayal so deep it would be remembered for generations. The silence after Richard's words was suffocating. Every guest sat frozen, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily on their hearts. All eyes remained fixed on Angela, collapsed on the floor, and Daniel, pale with fury and shame. Richard turned to his lawyer. "Mr. Adwale, proceed." The lawyer stood, opening the sealed envelope with deliberate care. His voice rang out clearly. "In the event of my passing, I, Richard Okoro, leave the majority of my fortune not to my wife or my brother, but to those who have stood by me with loyalty. My staff, my charities, my children, those who have not betrayed my trust, will inherit." Gasps rippled through the hall. Angela's face drained of all color, her lips trembling. "No, no, Richard, you cannot. I was your wife, I—" Richard's gaze was cold steel. "You were my wife in name, Angela, but in truth, you buried that vow long ago." Daniel leapt up, his voice shaking. "This is outrageous. You can't cut me out of the business. I've given years." "You've taken more than you've given," Richard cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. "From this day forward, you are disowned, banished from the company and from this family. You will never touch another brick of what I built." Daniel's shoulders sagged under the humiliation. He tried to speak, but his words died in his throat. Angela, on the floor, clutched at Richard's legs, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Please, Richard, don't do this to me. I only wanted to be free." Richard pulled away, his expression unmoved. "And now you are free of me, free of my name, free of everything you coveted." The lawyer's closing words rang like a gavel. "So it is written, so it is done." The guests rose, stunned, whispering among themselves as they filed out. The empire had shifted in a single morning. Angela remained behind, weeping, but her tears were not for love. They were for the fortune that had slipped through her grasp. When the hall emptied, Richard stood alone at the window, staring out at the gardens that had once been symbols of pride. For years, he had believed that wealth was a fortress, a shield against loneliness and betrayal. But now he knew the truth. Wealth could buy power, it could buy respect, but it could never buy loyalty, and it could never buy love. Behind him, Adwael approached quietly. "You did the right thing, Richard. Better to know the truth than to live in a lie." Richard nodded slowly, his reflection in the glass showing a man both broken and reborn. "I lost a wife. I lost a brother, but perhaps I gained clarity." He thought of the loyal staff who had stood by him, of the charities that would now benefit, of the children he had once distanced himself from but could still reconcile with. There were still people who cared, not for his money, but for the man he truly was. Turning from the window, Richard walked down the hall with firm steps. The empire could be rebuilt, his fortune could be managed, but his heart, though scarred, would heal in time. The world would remember the funeral where the dead returned, but Richard would remember it as the day he buried betrayal and chose truth.